Well, good morning, everybody, and congratulations for being here. The Sunday morning slot at 9 a.m. at any of these conferences, the toughest slot to fill. So the fact that you've all showed up means that you had a great time, but an early time, and we can get on with this. So thank you so much for being here. This is going to be a fun session. And I'm going to introduce our guest in just one second. I do want to say one thing, though, that as we go on, if you want to ask a question other than when I pass the microphone around, just go on your app. I have this thing here that will show me your questions, and we'll try and get in as many as we possibly can. So feel free to interact as best you can. Now, let me tell you about our guest. I'm sure many of you know him. Senator Chris Murphy is from Connecticut. He serves on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's on the subcommittee of European Affairs, Middle East Terrorism. In fact, he's on all sorts of subcommittees. Prior to going into the U.S. Senate, he was in the U.S. House of Representatives. Prior to that, he was in the Connecticut Senate. Prior to that, he was in the Connecticut House of Representatives. Basically, this is a man who has trouble holding down a job. That said, he's also one of the youngest members, or was one of the youngest members, getting old now, of the U.S. Senate. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, Senator Chris Murphy. Well, good morning.
Morning.
Morning. Hey, I heard some nice things about you yesterday.
Did you?
Yeah, which I thought you'd like to hear. There are a group here of young leaders who you hosted for lunch at the U.S. Embassy.
That's right.
Yesterday. You got some pretty terrific reviews. I think some of the young leaders are here. Where are you? Right here? Okay, you'll back me up on this, right? He was pretty good over lunch?
I still like to consider myself a young leader, so.
Senator, you get to a point in life where I am right now where everybody is a young leader. I'm not among them. I want to make clear to everybody here that Senator Murphy has graciously accepted to take responsibility for every U.S. foreign policy decision in the last 50 years. He will not only explain them, he will defend them.
Bring it on. I noticed, by the way, that we are the only session over the course of 3 days that's labeled a debate.
Yes.
So
right.
I'm ready.
Okay, well, have at him then. Listen, I want to start, there's so many areas for us to get into. But I noticed that your American colleagues in the past couple of days have, I thought, quite graciously punted the whole question of the election over to you.
Yeah.
So let's deal with the elephant in the room right off the bat. And there's no better way for me to start this than to say two words: Donald Trump. Yeah. I know it's Sunday morning and this is awful for me to do to you, but give us a sense from your side as to what the nature of because before we can understand what America wants to do post-Obama, let's get into the political head for a minute and figure out where the country is.
So, I come to this, of course, with my own bias. I'm a Democrat. I'm a Hillary Clinton supporter. But I think that what's happening in the United States psychologically isn't going to sound or feel unfamiliar from a lot of the underlying dynamics that we've been talking about here with respect to Europe and specifically Central Europe over the course of the last 3 days. First and foremost, there is a tremendous economic anxiety in the United States today, and I feel it in a palpable sense every single day that I'm home in Connecticut. And yes, we have been successful in recovering from this recession, frankly, maybe better and more robustly than the rest of the world. Our unemployment is almost down to structural lows again in the 5% range. GDP has been consistently growing. Jobs have been consistently growing. But there are tens of millions of Americans who, though they're back to work, are working less hours, are working for less, have their health care and retirement benefits dried up or vanished over that period of time. I think that there's lots that differentiates the Trump phenomenon and the Sanders phenomenon. But there is also something that is common about their stories in the sense that, I tend to give voters more credit than most do. I think there's a lot of voters who, understand that what each of those candidates, and in particular Trump, is peddling is very unrealistic. This idea that, just with rhetoric we can turn around the country overnight, pay for free college, whatever it is that is being promised. But what is more unrealistic to voters than what they're being promised by the candidates is the status quo, is their lives continuing to tumble out of control economically on the trajectory that they are, and so they're willing to take a chance. And so I think you have to start from the premise that the overlay of good economic data in the United States doesn't tell the true story. And so you've got a political moment that feels a little revolutionary. Now, in the end, I think that Americans will come back to candidates like Hillary Clinton, who I think propose some fairly substantial change, but are going to do it in a more responsible way. But the second piece of this story is also from Trump. A very familiar anti-immigrant, anti-migrant positioning that has appealed, I think, to a much smaller segment of the electorate than the economic messaging appeals to. But there is an easy explanation for lots of people in America as to why their life is in a much tougher, more difficult position than it is. It's easy to explain the security challenges when you just blame it on a subset of individuals, and to the extent that you're seeing that rhetoric play out successfully here in Europe, it also has played successfully in the United States. Now, the polls tell you that in a general election matchup right now, Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders beats Donald Trump by double digits, and so this may be a phenomenon that only is about the primary, but it does tell you some significant things about what's happening in the United States.
And just following on that, just to get deeper into the mind hive of American politics, there does seem to be a substantial shift, at least on the Republican side. And I ask this question in terms of how this is going to play out for everybody else. You talked about the economic uncertainty of the middle class. We've seen the Republicans move away from their traditional base of being limited government and free trade or free markets, more towards managed trade, or in cases of Donald Trump, no trade at all, and anti-immigrant, which is now sort of appears to be the Republican base. When this is all over, and let's assume that Hillary Clinton is the next president of the United States, that current is still running in the baseline of American politics. How does it, or does it, affect what happens next, knowing that current is there?
Well, listen, I think when it comes to this question of where the Republican Party is going to be positioned on trade, this is a real ground level phenomenon in the United States. And I thought Madeleine Albright did a wonderful job explaining why that is when she talked about the story of going to a shoe factory in Maine and really having no answer for the people who were out of work. And one of the big pieces of news in the States over the course of the last 2 months has been a Carrier air conditioning factory employing about 2,000 people in Indiana, shipping jobs down to Mexico, and they're pretty clear and plain about the reasons for that, much lower wages and much lower environmental standards. And of course, we're now 2 decades after the implementation of NAFTA. People told us that 20 years later, we would have started to close the gap in terms of labor costs and environmental costs. And so it does not become a great advertisement for future trade deals when those gaps haven't been closed. That being said, I think that as long as there is an answer for those individuals who are being laid off from the shoe factory, both the Republican and Democratic Party can be in favor of trade agreements. It's just that neither party has had a particularly good answer about what the alternative is going to be to the flight of manufacturing jobs. On the immigration side, I wish that the Republican Party came to the right place on immigration. I would argue that the bill that passed the Senate 2 years ago, which provides a pathway to citizenship, fixes our existing broken immigration system, is the right place to be. I wish they got there for policy reasons, but they'll get there for political reasons. Why? You cannot win a presidential campaign in the United States with 20 to 30% of the Hispanic vote. And they will realize that maybe once and for all in this November's election. And so for political reasons, the Republican Party is going to have to sort of come out of their anti-immigration shell, or they will become irrelevant for national political purposes. And so I do see a light at the end of the tunnel on that issue, and I think the Republican Party eventually becomes much more moderate on that issue.
I want to follow up on one thing. You wrote in Foreign Policy magazine, Principles for a New Foreign Policy, a guideline, a blueprint, if you want, for the Democratic Party. An 8-point plan. One of the things that really struck me about it was your first point, and that was that you felt that there should be a new Marshall Plan, that you should extend beyond the defense budget when it comes to foreign policy, and specifically for countries that are threatened, and I should get you to explain it rather than me explaining it to you, for countries that are threatened, for example, by Russia and by China. Well, we happen to be in a part of the world right now where this is a very real issue for people. Can you just expand a little bit on what you mean by the new Marshall Plan?
Well, so the broader point of the piece, which we talked about building a new progressive foreign policy, is anchored in my worry that the United States is in a moment of great uncertainty about how we engage in the world, and in particular within my party, there's a fear that we will retrench into some form of isolationism because we don't know how the right way is to try to help manage world affairs other than military intervention. And so the point of my piece, which I wrote with 2 other young senators, is that there are a myriad of ways in which we can power up non-military influencers funded by the U.S. government that can make a difference. And we certainly did make this plan to build out a new Marshall Plan in the Middle East. I would argue in sections of the Russian periphery. I always come back to a visit I made to Belgrade a year and a half ago, a day on which Putin was marching his military through the streets of Belgrade in an enormous display of military assets available to the Serbian people, and our ambassador was begging me for $10,000 to keep open an exchange program that was being shut down. We're starving a lot of our international development and international exchange and economic development programs. We spend 20 times as much money on the military as we do on foreign aid. In 1950, when we were helping rebuild Europe, 3% of our GDP was dedicated to foreign aid. Today, it's 0.1%. And so I'm glad that this has now become a bipartisan idea. Lindsey Graham just last week floated the idea of joining me and others on a new Marshall Plan. His was specific for the Middle East, but I think there's a conversation to be had about broadening it. And I think there are Republicans and Democrats realizing that if we want to really be relevant in the world today, that we've got to be doing something other than just offering foreign military sales. There are other ways in which we can make a difference.
One of your points in your 8-point proposal dealt with multilateralism and the need for U.S. foreign policy to be at least instructed to some degree by the notion of who's in with you and who's against you. I think you said that if we don't have any allies willing to join the coalition of the willing, maybe that's a sign that we shouldn't be doing what we're about to do, which is interesting because it brings me to NATO, and I want to bring up a couple of questions that have already come in from the audience. It's where we want to go anyway. The whole notion of NATO being a relevant force, the notion of the critics saying there's a lot of free riders on NATO. You guys are picking up most of the bill. If we could go to, I just want to show the 2 questions that are relevant to this. The first one, do you think that Donald Trump correctly diagnosed that with regards to NATO's European flank, European countries individually are not doing enough for its defense and thus would be in the American interest to support collective EU security cooperation? And then finally, the next question, is Donald Trump a threat to U.S.-Russia relationship? Well, is he a threat to any relationship with the United States?
I think the belief that Donald Trump is a threat to a relationship rests on the premise that he has a chance of being president of the United States, which I would argue is slim to none. But no, I mean, let's dispense very early on with the notion that there is any broad, fertile ground for Donald Trump's notion that the United States should walk away from its commitment to NATO. I think everyone was surprised by it because none of us pick up any sentiment of that feeling amongst the public. Now, there, of course, has been a strain of American thought, both, on the ground floor, but also amongst the those that make foreign policy in Washington, that there's got to be more cost sharing on behalf of the Europeans, and that there's got to be a conversation here about how to divide responsibilities to make those contributions more meaningful and more efficient. But that's a very different conversation, one that's been going on for a long time, than what Trump is proposing, which would be a wholesale reevaluation of the relationship. I think he is largely isolated in that viewpoint, and it certainly is only yet another interesting phenomenon of his campaign, not something that's endemic of a larger conversation happening in the United States today.
I'm sure this is going to come up in a minute, and we are going to go to the audience. But because that question was brought up about U.S.-Russia relationship, let's take Trump out of the equation on that one. And let me just ask you that with the posturing of the Russian Federation at the moment, if you stared 2 years, 3 years into the future, the posture of the United States when it comes to dealing with a newly aggressive Russia, is the policy going to change that much from where you are right now?
Well, and listen, we have no idea what Donald Trump or Ted Cruz would do, so I think it's hard to predict. But no, I don't imagine that there's going to be a radical reorientation of policy, but of course, a lot depends on the decisions that are made here. So we are resolute in our belief that sanctions have to continue, that if they don't, if there is a fraying of them, that it will be a victory to the Russians and perhaps the end of the dream of returning sovereignty to Ukraine. And so we are going to continue to press on this question of sanctions rollover, and we hope and expect that our European partners will continue along with us. I would argue that to the extent that there would be a change in American foreign policy, that we would understand that the real threat to Ukraine, frankly, is economic. There's a military threat, but what the Russians are really attempting to do is not to militarily own Ukraine. They are attempting to economically break it such that there eventually is a political spiral that installs someone that is much more friendly to the Russians in Kyiv. And so, I worry about this continued conditionality that gets put on our funding sources to Ukraine, in the sense that while I want to press them to take on corruption, I'm not necessarily sure that we should require them to fix all of their economic problems in the middle of an invasion force occupying their country. There shouldn't be a conditionality on supporting sovereignty. And so I'd like to see a much more robust flow of U.S. funds and international funds going into Ukraine with a little bit better understanding of the pace in which they can handle economic reforms. But other than that adjustment, I think that U.S. policy will largely continue.
I'm being very selfish by taking up all the questions here. So I'd like to become unselfish and ask if anybody would like to join this conversation. There's a lot more to cover. I mean, we haven't even touched on Brexit. We haven't touched on the migrant crisis yet, which are two key, I would think, considerations for future American foreign policy. But would anybody like to join the conversation with the Senator? Yes, ma'am.
Good morning, Senator.
Good morning.
Koni Rakunin Bakri from Indonesia Institute for Maritime Studies. You are mentioning about the millennial paradox. I think we're not living in the Socrates words. So coming from the region that you are applying the US pivot, my question to you, because the world is divided by two groups, which is group of the coalition of the willing and the group of the non-alignment. So what do you think our part of the world should take care of it? I mean, do we have to really go into diplomacy or more to military? Because in my opinion, for the non-alignment movement countries, we need to develop really our military instead of diplomacy. Thank you.
Well, I mean, that's the point of our piece is to encourage the United States to understand that we're living in an era of asymmetric warfare, right? And in a way, we are an apple in a world full of oranges. We still have the most powerful, most robust, most capable military in the world, but the way in which our adversaries, and in some ways our enemies, are projecting power is in ways that are very different than the strengths and assets that the United States has built. So Russia is projecting power, yes, occasionally through the movement of military forces, but really through intimidation, bribery, graft, through energy, through lots of other means that have nothing to do with military might. China's expansion of influence has to do with their ability to put dollars, resources into countries in their periphery, into Africa. And again, the United States has lesser means to do that, to project our economic power through aid dollars than ever before. You know, I think we continue to need to have the military capacity to respond when necessary, and I think you're seeing that capacity play out in a meaningful and useful form in the Middle East today, but we've got to build up all of these other influencers that have atrophied over the years and understand that if you really want to compete in a world of asymmetric warfare, then you have to have those other tools at your disposal. Our toolkit is just misaligned to the world today, and I think that's the argument that many of us are trying to make.
I'd like to continue with any other comments or questions. I do want to warn you that although I seem like a very nice guy, I can be a miserable jerk when it comes to the length of questions. So I just warn everybody in advance that I need, within the first 20 seconds, to hear the beginning of the formation of a question. And can I just give kudos to whoever it was who stood up yesterday and went on with about a 5-minute question, and finally, the moderator said, well, what's your question? And he said, I just want to know if he agrees with me or not. This is not a fair way to answer. Sir, you had your hand up.
Thank you very much. My name is Adrian Newman from the Institute for Security Policy in Kiel, Germany. And I would like to know, Senator, where is your compass to decide to strike the balance between values and interests, specifically considering many unintended consequences we've seen of past political decisions? And what kind of role do you see for the responsibility to protect in this now multipolar world? Thank you very much.
And just before you answer, Senator, can I just point out to everybody, this is one of our GlobSec young leaders. So welcome. Good to have you here. Senator.
Well, I don't think there's any doubt that the United States has to have a values-based foreign policy, right? If we ultimately want to continue to be an attractive model to the world, to be a country that others want to align themselves with, then we can't simply be making decisions based on our strategic interests. And so clearly there has to be a values basis to our foreign policy. That being said, I think we have to understand, certainly in the post-Iraq and Afghanistan war world, what the limits of American military power are. And I think we still, to an extent, have a leftover hubris about the ability of the US military to try to change political realities on the ground in places like the Middle East that is mismatched with reality. And so I don't think that those two conversations are exclusive. I don't think that you have to walk away from a values-based foreign policy if you admit that there are parts of the world in which the United States may not be able to make the difference that we would like without buy-in on the ground. You know, and I would, bring back the conversation about the transatlantic relationship to this question of values as well. We've got a decision, a communal decision to make as to whether the transatlantic alliance is one based on values or one based on just occasional security interests, occasional economic interests. And, whether it's this question of whether or not sovereignty is something worth standing up for in and around the European continent, whether or not it's the value of inclusion of people fleeing torture and terror. We are at a moment in which the transatlantic alliance together is making a decision about what we stand for is going to be values-based or interest-based. And I would argue, just like I think that our foreign policy has to have values at the heart of it, if our alliance doesn't have values at the heart of it, then, I don't know that it stands the test of time. So, again, I thought Secretary Albright put it to us in a way last night that was the appropriate challenge, and this is a moment for us to decide whether we are still a values-based alliance.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Anya. I'm from Belarus. Recently, a lot of attention has been paid to US-Russia relations. However, my question is about US-China relations, since this topic has to be long forgotten. Obama administration declared the pivot to Asia, and I'm just wondering how this is going to change with the new administration, and how do you see the U.S.-China relation evolving?
Well, first of all, I think that's the most overwrought word in the last 10 years of American foreign policy. This idea that we were pivoting to anywhere, and hopefully for our friends in the audience here that care deeply about the U.S.-Europe relationship, the proof is in the pudding that a pivot has not happened, right? So we are talking about a historic new trade agreement with Europe. We are currently debating the next round of $3.4 billion in financing for a European reassurance initiative. We're pre-positioning and forward positioning forces inside Central and Eastern Europe in a way that we wouldn't have contemplated 4 or 5 years ago. So this idea that we are pivoting away from relationships in this part of the world to relationships in another part of the world is nonsense. What we are doing is recognizing that, again, as others have said, as you look forward to the next 20 years, the most important relationship in the world is going to be the relationship between the United States and China. The function of the world economy in some way, shape, or form will depend on our ability to get along, and our ability in tandem with Europe to push back on the tendency of emerging economies like China and India to drag product standards, food safety standards, financial standards down to the bottom. For a very long time, we have taken for granted the free passage of commercial shipping on the seas, which will be brought into doubt if we don't speak with with a strong backbone with respect to the changes that are being made in the seas around China and the control that they're trying to exert. So I think this is as complicated a relationship as exists. I think President Obama has managed it fairly well. I think to the extent that you have not seen major flare-ups of this relationship over the last 8 years, it speaks to the success with which we've parried back and forth. I don't believe that there's any reorientation happening of our policy in other parts of the world. It's just a recognition that this is a relationship that's as important as it gets.
I think we had, yes, ma'am.
Thank you, sir, for a very interesting overview. My name is Irina. I'm from Georgia. You've mentioned about the extension of sanctions to Russia, and we do hope that sanctions will be prolonged. But frankly speaking, sometimes, me personally, I have a feeling that Europe lacks realistic and pragmatic assessment of Russian politics. As a reminder, when 08 happened, and it was war between Georgia and Russia, we were saying that, politicians from Georgia were saying that Ukraine would be next. But by that time, for 1-2 years, people were smiling on this. So we've seen what happened. So my question is, from the US perspective, is there a realistic assessment of Mr. Putin and what he can do? Thank you.
Well, I think there absolutely is, which is why I would argue we've been leading this conversation of a strong international response to his aggression inside Ukraine. And I've heard this conversation at this conference from countries who really don't believe that they are under any threat, and thus they think there should be some moderation of this conversation about our policy towards Russia. Well, let's remember that 4 or 5 years ago, very few Ukrainians ever thought that they would be under threat of Russian invasion, and things changed in a heartbeat. So I do believe that if you don't send a very strong signal and a consistent signal that remains until there has been compliance with the Minsk agreement and some path forward from Crimea, that you can't rule out that a NATO country is next. And I think it's hard to believe that you're ever going to have Russian forces moving into a NATO country, but I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility that if there isn't a continued strong response to what's happening in Ukraine, that you wouldn't see little green men, domestic insurgencies that somehow feel and seem stronger than they should be otherwise, popping up in countries that are protected by Article 5. So, remember, we are only a handful of years into the sanctions. And if you look at successful sanctions regimes around the world, whether it be the Russian sanctions in the wake of the invasion of Afghanistan, whether it be multilateral sanctions on Iran's nuclear program that forced them to come to the table, it wasn't 1 or 2 years of sanctions that did the job, it was multiple years. And so Russia, of course, has been famous over the course of their history for playing the long game. We have to be willing to engage in a very long, hard fight to protect this fundamental concept of sovereignty that will be an issue for other countries in this region if we don't stay solid and unified in our response to Russian aggression. And let me note that sanctions is not the only part of this conversation. I mean, I find it wildly ironic that countries are enthusiastic about continuing sanctions, but are talking about allowing a pipeline to bring Russian gas in and around Ukraine into Europe by other means. If we want to continue to send a strong message to the Russians, then it's not just about sanctions. It's also about cutting off their sources of political leverage on the continent, which of course we know is the distribution of their fossil fuel assets. So there's got to be a consistency to the message that we send that isn't just about sanctions. And this conversation that's happening about Nord Stream right now is in many ways just as important as the conversation that we're having about the rollover of these financial and oil and gas sanctions.
Senator, can I just jump in here, because over the past couple of days we've heard this mentioned a lot, and of course it's front and center for European governments right now, and that is the migrant crisis, as they call it. Your view on that, and how the U.S. might react, especially if politics in Europe starts turning in a sort of a populist nationalist type of way as a result of this.
I think the first thing to say is that the United States has witnessed these similar waves of migration over time. And while the numbers are not similar today, we certainly over the years have perceived waves of immigrants from Eastern and Central Europe, from Central and South America as presenting crises to the United States. But of course, they, in retrospect, have not been crises. They have been the foundational root strength of our economy and our democracy. And when I go around to the United States and give speeches to my chambers of commerce, who are sometimes in a pessimistic mood about the future of the American economy, I just read to them the average age of competitor nations in 2030, right? And in the United States, our average age remains under 40. Over the course of the next 15 years, we only age by 2 years, whereas our competitors in Asia and Europe, their average ages start to crawl up to near 50, which ultimately starts to make their economic calculuses and their public budgets almost impossible to manage. So, to me, well, the immediacy certainly presents a crisis because the numbers are overwhelming. But of course, to a few specific countries, this should be perceived in the medium and long run as an opportunity to address what is, a demographic crisis presented to the country. Now, I'm frankly ashamed that my country hasn't done more to help manage the immediate crisis, which would allow for, I think, Europe to see this as a potential long-term strength. I don't understand how the United States, lets in 10,000 refugees when during the Bosnian crisis, during the Vietnam War, we were letting in 200,000. And so, Friends of Europe need to do a better job of challenging the U.S. government to be participatory in the handling of this migrant crisis. But we've got to help, I think, our friends here see this as, ultimately a potential strength of the continent, not a liability.
Let's go back out to the audience. We've got lots of hands up here. Yes, sir. This row here.
Martin Michelot from the European Institute for European Policy in Prague. I had a question about the use of military force. The European-American intervention in Libya was decried for the lack of its follow-on efforts. There were just plans announced in the New York Times this morning about more involvement of US troops and trainers in Syria and Iraq. I wanted to know whether you foresaw in the next 10 years an increased use of military force, and whether we would be using military force to achieve the same sort of effects, which is to say, possibly regime change and whether you had any plans in your mind of how this would also help countries build democracy, if this is something we still want to do. So basically just this question of whether you see the use of military force being increased in the years to come, or whether this is a downwards trend that is here to stay. Thank you very much.
Well, I think that there is, a tremendous war weariness in the United States, and I think it exists on both sides of the political ledger. I think it's fascinating on the Republican side of the presidential race. Marco Rubio, who to many people was perceived as the sort of logical favorite, ran on a traditional neoconservative, interventionalist foreign policy, and couldn't get past 10% in many of these primaries. And I think that's in part because that school of thought that U.S. military intervention can solve some of the most vexing problems, and that there's American public support for it is certainly waning. I mean, my issue is largely that the American public is not willing to support the level and sustainment of intervention necessary to really get these jobs done. And I think Syria is a perfect example. I'm a Democrat. I've been very supportive of my president, but I think that there has been very little evidence that our limited military intervention in Syria has made a difference at all. We sort of are, trying to we're trying to be involved without actually having the willingness to support the level of force necessary to get the job done. And so, I think at the beginning of any proposed intervention, you have to understand exactly what your end game is and understand the level of resources necessary to get it done. And if you don't have the popular political support in your country to do everything that is necessary to achieve your end state, then I don't know that you can make the argument that it's worthwhile in the first place. And I think it's very, very hard to sit here and say that it was not worthwhile to try to stop a potential genocide inside Libya, but it is hard, I think, to make the argument that the chaos that we wrought, in part, by intervention there was worth it in the end, because we didn't know what the end state was. We weren't really prepared to do all that was necessary in order to achieve it, and though we certainly prevented something awful from happening in those moments around the intervention, we set off a chain of events, in part, that has brought far more misery, arguably, to that country than we solved in the short term.
Senator, can I take a look at the other side of the interventionist coin, and that is deterrence? And there's a question that came in on the GlobSec app. I'd just like to read it to you. It said, would the U.S. approve stationing a large number of its troops in Europe to deter Russian expansionism?
Well, I think the question is yes, and we are right now contemplating moving 2 brigades into Europe to send, that very strong message. And that's in part because we have a very specific treaty obligation here in Europe that we need to defend, and so it's a matter of spending, smart money early on deploying forward position brigades rather than having to come in on the back end to defend Article 5. So I think you have a slightly different conversation when you're talking about countries in which you have treaty obligations. But I would argue that you have to perceive deterrence through other prisms other than the projection of military force. The reason that we are arguing on both sides of the aisle for a new Marshall Plan, in particular in the Middle East, is that deterrence is also about trying to cure the underlying causes of extremism. And the fact is that whether it be in the Middle East or in Africa, we simply don't have the flexible ability to move money in a way that tries to address those underlying causes. And so deterrence has to be thought of in both military means and non-military means. And right now, largely in the United States, we still think about deterrence through military means.
Let's go back out on the floor. Lots of hands up. Where have I not been yet? Over there in the back. Yes, sir. I think or ma'am. I'm terribly sorry. I can't see you. There you are. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Bon Johara from the Tokyo Foundation, Japan. Simple question. Does the United States have an idea to keep the dominant power in every region in the world to protect international order based on the common sense of value, like the freedom, human rights? If yes, then how to prevent the power shift or power dispersion? Thank you.
Well, we are stretched thinner than ever before today, and I do think there is great interest, both in the administration and in the Congress, of empowering our allies to take more responsibility for their own security. So I don't envision a world in which the United States 20, 30 years from now is the guarantor of security in every part of the world. I envision a world in which we have asked many of our partners to take an increasing share of responsibility, in part because there is a limit to American resources. But listen, we continue to be an indispensable nation. I don't buy this narrative that I hear in some parts of the world that America is in retreat in the world. We may be spread thinner than ever before. The challenges may be more vexing, but if you want to try to solve a problem, you are still going to place your first call to the American president. And so I think we will continue to be ever present as we also have a desire to share security responsibilities with many of our partners.
Yes, sir. Right here.
Thank you very much. Selim Koru from the Economic Policy Research Foundation of Turkey. My question will be on Syria, particularly what I see as, I've been watching Ankara's response to Syria over the past 5 years, and it feels like a lot of times that Ankara is feeling that the US has not been there as much as it should be on Syria policy. And this has led to the feeling that Turkey's entered into a post-NATO sort of world where it can rely less and less on NATO. Now, we might think that this is not true, that the US is still behind its alliances, but it still creates the feeling that in its allies that something has changed. Do you think that feeling is a problem, and do you think that the United States should address it somehow? Thank you.
Well, I would argue that Turkey should be careful for what they wish for. If what they are proposing is a large-scale U.S. military intervention or deployment inside Syria in order to remove Bashar al-Assad or to take on other interests that they perceive to be threats, I would argue, and many of us would argue, that that would lead to a long-term spiral of instability in that country that would be hard to recover from. And from our perspective, we have seen that the large-scale deployment of U.S. military forces in the Middle East ultimately draw in extremists, draw in foreign fighters in a way that is unique, which is why we have been trying to stand up local forces inside Iraq and inside Syria to take this fight. And I think when the story of Syria is written, and listen, I'm not speaking for the administration on this, I'm just speaking for myself, I think Turkey is going to have to answer some very tough questions about its conduct in the early stages of that war and who they allowed across their border into that fight. So we had been asking very loudly and often very quietly for much more support from Turkey in the early stages that we didn't receive. And so I think Turkey's going to have some questions that need to be answered as well. But for those that want the United States to deploy major military resources to solve this problem, it may provide some temporary solve to a very large wound, but in the end, it provides no solution. In the end, if we have learned anything from Iraq and Afghanistan, it's that the shock and awe that results from U.S. military deployment ultimately leads to greater instability because we let local players off the hook for owning the solutions to these problems. And so President Obama has made this case that this is a long, hard fight that involves standing up local forces. And I know that that's not satisfactory to those that want an immediate answer, but I think it's how you get long-term stability in a way that we didn't achieve in places like Afghanistan and Iraq.
What I'd like to do now is just take about 2 or 3 questions in a row, and then, Senator, you can respond to it. Sir, and I must say the 20-second rule still applies. It has not yet been waived.
Goodness. Philip Blond, Res Publica. My question really is, Senator, about Western values. What are they and how we can defend them anew? Because all of our enemies are winning an ideational war. In Russia, they're arguing Western liberalism leads to collapse of social fabric. Islamic State, where the West is decadent. And unfortunately, this is repeated at home with Trump, with the various secessionist, racist, and nationalist movements. How do we rearm Western values, and how do we recapitulate and actually advocate them in a way that works, rather than repeating things that sound tired? Rights-based discourse, for instance, doesn't tell us what is right. And our enemies know this. How do we rearm Western values so they can win?
Thank you, Philip. Yes, ma'am. Sitting right back here.
Thank you very much. Susanna from Slovakia. I'm also part of the Gulf Young program. So I would like to ask about the Brexit, because that was the issue we haven't spoke about yet. Potential Brexit, it could not only be a problem for the EU, and we do not really wish for it, but also for the transatlantic relations and NATO. So my question would be, what, in your opinion, should US do to prevent Brexit, and how could it endanger the alliation? Thank you.
Okay, and I'll take one more, if you can remember all these things.
You can help me remember.
They're all good. They're all good. One more. Yes, sir, in the middle of the back there.
Good morning, Senator. Matthew Rhodes from the George C. Marshall Center. At risk of dragging the discussion towards process issues, I'd be interested in your thoughts on the current relationship between the Congress and the presidency in foreign policy making, and any ideas you might have for strengthening the role of the Congress.
So I'll try to give a short answer to this question of values, because it's one that you could spend an hour and a half on. Listen, clearly our values are rooted in liberal democracies and open economies. But let's not pretend that the retreat in places in Europe away from those values is purely organic, right? I mean, much of this is manufactured by an export of Russian money into not-for-profits and supposedly objective media sources that are purveying a Russian worldview that is determined to essentially, it sort of projects a nihilism in a sense, a belief that there's no truth in the world, just muddying and confusion of underlying values. And so, I would argue that the way in which we promote our values is to, get back into the game about pushing back on this kind of propaganda and this kind of purchase of the distribution of information. Rob Portman, a Republican senator, and I have proposed a new American fund to counter propaganda that is, I think, in part seeding this question of transatlantic values. And I don't think it's enough to just re-articulate what our values are. I think you actually have to push back on the way in which they're being undermined in a very active way by countries like Russia. On Brexit, I think we need to make it clear that the transatlantic relationship becomes much more difficult if Britain decides to leave the EU relationship. At the same time, I don't know that it's terribly useful for the United States to try to tell the people of Great Britain what they should do for themselves. I think this is a mature democracy in which they need to have the ability to evaluate the pluses and the minuses. We would argue that there's a lot more minuses, but I don't know that it would be particularly helpful to the cause of continued European integration for the United States to be overtly trying to throw our weight around inside this discussion. And then on the question of the role between the United States Congress and the President, listen, I argue regularly that the United States Congress has largely abdicated our responsibility when it comes to being a co-equal branch to setting foreign policy with the presidency. And we've done that in large part because the world is terribly messy today, And it's much easier to push off the tough decisions to the executive branch. And Libya is a perfect example. The United States Congress should have had a debate about U.S. military intervention in Libya. The war against ISIS is another example. This is a declaration of war against a new enemy, and yet the United States Congress has not passed an authorization of war. Why? Because it's difficult. Because we don't want to get into the messy details about what the extent and scope of that intervention should be, whether there should be tactical limitations on it, whether there should be time limitations on it. And so by refusing to have discussions about the authorization of military intervention, whether it be in Libya or in Syria or in Iraq, we essentially are making the Congress irrelevant. I've argued in the last 3 weeks that we should also be exercising more oversight over the scope of foreign arms sales. I mean, very quietly, the United States has increased by a factor of about 40 to 50% arms sales into the Middle East during the last 4 years. Now, there was a time back in the 80s where there was robust debate in the United States Senate, in the United States Congress, about the utility of those arms sales to U.S. national security objectives. You hear almost no discussion about that today. So, I think the Congress has to get back in the game on a number of these questions, and there are many people like myself, like Senator Tim Kaine, who are making that argument inside the Senate.
Senator, this may be an all-encompassing question, but it's a good one for the end. When you look out over the world and your responsibilities as a U.S. Senator on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, what keeps you awake at night?
Well, let's talk about something that that has not gotten a lot of conversation. What keeps me awake at night is the western shelf of Antarctica. Right? What keeps me awake at night are many of the questions and crises that are going to appear on the globe 10 and 20 and 50 years from today that we absolutely have control over today. Right? I think the United States has grown accustomed to the idea that that we can solve any and all problem in the world, and I think a lot of us are asking the United States to sort of question this hubris that has, I think, in the end, sometimes caused more misery due to U.S. intervention than problems solved. But, one of the things that keeps me up at night is the problem of climate change is one that we can solve today. It's at the root of much of the instability we witness currently, whether it's be the droughts in and around Mali or the droughts in and around Syria that promoted much of that economic instability. And what we are seeing today is, forgive the pun, the tip of the iceberg. So there are a lot of things that keep me up at night. Certainly the rise of China, the future of Russia's intervention inside Europe, the future of Europe itself worries me. But we haven't given a lot of conversation over the course of these 3 days to the maybe greatest global challenge that is presented to us, which is the potentially revolutionary impact of climate change if we don't all, as a globe, get it right. I've got a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old at home, and so when I think about those long-term catastrophic challenges presented to my kids and my potential grandkids, that's at the top of the list. And any sort of international gathering has to, come away with some consensus about how we confront that challenge, just as much as we talk about how we confront the challenge of China or the challenge of Russia or the challenge of the British exit from the European Union. That's as big and as important a question as there is, and we all bear responsibility for mismanaging it if it's not at the top of our agenda.
Senator Murphy, you have been very generous with your time and your thoughts today, and on behalf of the entire audience, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to be as thoughtful as you have been with us this morning. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Just before we take our leave, and I'll keep it to 20 seconds, the rule applies to me as well. The organizers would like to remind you to be back in the hall at 10:30 for the next session. Once again, thank you all very much, and have a great day.